Welcome, everybody. So the objective of this evening is to really concentrate on you as transect walkers and how you tell species apart. Now, it's a rather different skill, in my opinion, to actually identifying a species because we don't have the luxury of insects being still. Quite often we are trying to identify things while they're flying, which makes it even more difficult. So we've got to use a range of different skills to help us determine what species we're dealing with. Now, I would guess when I'm recording, surveying, I can be sure maybe of about half of what I see. The other half has to be based on good, intelligent guesses. And I'm being strictly honest with you tonight. That is a necessity. So we have to count 100% of the butterflies we see, but we're going to have to make quite intelligent guesses, probably on nearly half of them. And tonight is really, the focus of tonight is getting those guesses as accurate as we can. That's a skill that we are trying to learn. What are we looking for? This little chart gives us a few clues to the different things that we can use to help us. The first one, which I think we'll probably all be familiar is the general color or the ground color, the background color of insects, which is different for each species. Although there's some common ones. So we have the whites, which are obviously have a white background. We have the browns, which have a brown background. The blues obviously are predominantly blue, etc. The other thing we can use is spots. Now, a lot of families have different arrangements for spots. Like, for example, the brown species all have different arrangements of spots, and we can use those for determining species. When it comes to the whites, which I know from most of you is the most tricky family of butterflies, wingtips and borders are really important. And the big showy butterflies, what we call the vanessids, like the small tortoiseshell and the peacock, they're all to do with bands. They have wide bands of color across them. They're very showy, different colors. The next most important probably is behavior. What a bird person would call the jizz of a species, how it flies, how it's behaving. Really important one. Time of year, obviously, because butterflies only live for, well, some only live for a day or two. Some will live for a whole year, but the average is about 10 days. And they're within certain flight periods. So it's very important that we know a little bit about what we should expect at any particular week of the year. Equally important is habitat, where they're actually flying. So you only see woodland butterflies generally in a woodland habitat, and heath butterflies in a heath, etc. When we move from open countryside into woodland, those species are going to change quite dramatically. Size, of course, is very important because they'll give us a lot of clues as to what the species is. So let's carry on and see our very first butterfly. So this is the family called the whites. Tonight is divided into families. So at the end of each family, we're going to invite you to ask any questions you have right then while it's fresh. And just to break it up a bit, because it could get a little bit monotonous, death by PowerPoint. I'm trying not to keep putting a load of text on the screen. I'm going to put it in bits and pieces so as to keep your eye in roughly the right place on the screen. Otherwise, it's going to get a little bit tiring. So let's proceed. The brimstone, and I hope some of you have already seen one this year. I've seen 2 or 3, not big numbers. It's a large butterfly. It's often the first butterfly to emerge from hibernation, but can actually be seen in almost every month of the year, all the way through. quite characteristic. In olden times, it was called the butter-colored fly, which then was transformed into the word that we know, butterfly. So that's the origin of the word. The male, of course, is this distinctive yellow color, a joyous color when you see the first one of the year. It's a wonderful sight. Always rests with its wings closed. It's almost impossible to get a picture of wings open with a brimstone. It's a very good reason is it's camouflage. You see all those wing veins. It's trying very, very hard to look like a leaf. And if you're going to look like a leaf, you've got to be closed up and hiding on a leaf. And you'd notice in its effort to look like a leaf, it has these points on its forewings and hind wings. Now, if you're lucky, if it's flying slowly, you can actually pick out those points on the wing. It also has these wonderful, like, broken veins where it's little red marks and little orange spots, like fungal infection on the leaf. It's a quite remarkable feat of camouflage, and there's good reason because they are heavily predated by birds. Now, a individual butterfly can live for almost a whole year. So the insects that we're seeing right now were emerged back in probably July, beginning of August. So they're already, what, 9, nearly coming on 10 months old. They have remarkable longevity. And also, you will notice a lot of butterflies get tattered and torn and bits missing. The brimstone never does. It's always almost pristine, a remarkable feat. It's a great wanderer, but it does favour the woodlands. If you want to see large numbers of brimstones, go to woodland. And there's quite a few in Yorkshire, and there are transects in some of those woodlands. I know on my particular transect, I can get on a particular day 20 or 30. While normally in our gardens, we only see an odd one. So they emerge from their pupa in mid to late July and will hibernate usually after a couple of weeks. So they will be feeding up in that period. And then they will occasionally reappear. It depends on the weather. Nobody really knows what causes them to reappear, but they will reappear in the autumn, quite sometimes in good numbers, but it's very variable. The fact you see none in September and October doesn't mean they're dead or gone away. They're just hibernating. Now, the females are very different, and obviously, because they're white, they are very easily confused with large whites. They share a lot of similarities in terms of size, about the same size as a large white butterfly. Um, so how you tell them apart is obviously the males are the yellow color, but the females I'll show you, are this wonderful, slightly greenish shade of kind of a creamy green. It's difficult to tell when they're in flight, but they do give out a little bit of green as they go past you. And you can occasionally, as I said before, just see those tips on the wings. So if you get the chance to check them, if they land, just check them and just see if it is a large white or a brimstone. And then you'll know brimstones are around. So that's my tip for brimstones. So the large white, probably the easiest of all the whites to determine. So it's a pest. It's the dreaded cabbage white butterfly. It's the largest. The main characteristic which you can use to pick it out when it's flying is it has a very purposeful directional flight. And that's important when when we're looking at all these different species of whites, and we're covering 5 tonight. This one probably has the fastest, most purposeful, and it's generally flying in a particular direction. It's also a migrant. and a good many of the specimens we see will have come from abroad. Certainly last year we had a big influx, and that quite often can take you by surprise on your transect. You get a big influx and a large number of large whites appear. It has two generations. First one's in April, so it's already started. I haven't seen one myself yet, probably later in the month. It generally is the smallest of the generations. The second generation, usually bigger, and it's supplemented with lots of migrants, is the July one. And the other difference is, and this happens with all the whites, is the later generations are much more darkly marked, which can help you with identification. Now notice the tips. This is the important bit. So I mentioned about using the tips as a means of identification, and this is the key. Where it wraps around that corner and comes way down this edge here, and it's a dark black. If you see that, you know it's a large white. And also if you see these large black spots, you know it's a large white. You can see these black tips when it's flying. So a good tip is look first for that purposeful directional flight and then see if you can see the black. If you can see the black, you know it's a large white. Two spots on the forewing and they're large. Males and females are different, at least on the upper wings. So here's a male, no spots, still got that wraparound black. But if you look very carefully, there's a spot there and the spot there, but it's only on the underside. And the underside is a kind of a yellowy green color, which is quite different from the small white, which is much more yellow. So the big tip, if it's large, the strong black marks are visible in flight, it has to be a large white. Okay, moving on. Small white. Also a common pest of brassica, but also on a wide range of other crucifers. It has to have the mustard, the mustard oil, which gives it a degree of unpleasantness for a bird to eat. It's his main protection. Now, compared with the large white, it's a much weaker, much more fluttery flight. It's also a migrant, two generations, very similar to the large white. And this is a spring generation. The markings are quite pale, but the July-September generation has a much stronger black color. Note the spots are much smaller, and also notice this tip. This tip does not wrap around the corner. It just goes along the top edge. It does not wrap around the edge. That is the main way of determining which it is. As you can see there, this is the female. You've got two spots and the dark tip there. This is a male, single spot. Yeah. The underneath is much more yellowy than the large white. So the tip is check your tips. Now there's also a mention here, use the proportion system. Now the next species, we'll get into that a bit more carefully, but we're not expecting you to identify all the whites. It's impossible. And the difference between a flying small white and a flying green vein white is very, very small. I don't think you can determine it by just looking. You have to be lucky and find one that's landed. So we have to use different systems, which I'm going to come to in a minute. The important thing to say about the green vein white, you always find it nearer shade, hedges, woodland edges, dikes. It's a damp lover. That's where its food plant, which is Well, it has a variety, also brassica species, but its most common is the same as the orange tip, which is the garlic mustard. It's also our most widespread, and it can live up to, I think, 300 meters in altitude, but it's also the most tricky species to identify. So let's get into it. First thing to say, it's even weaker fluttery flight, aimlessly wandering. Well, at least a small white will be going in one direction for a little while. The green vein white just wanders aimlessly. Two generations. The second generation bigger. Occasionally you get a third generation in a warm year. The later generations have stronger marks. This, I would say, is a second generation butterfly because it's much darker. The veins are very obvious. Um, the spring generation is also very variable in size. So you get small ones and big ones, which does make it even more confusing. It has the dark tips, and the dark tips wrap around like a large white, but they are broken by white. So it's only the veins which are dark towards the edge, and each of the veins is tinged black. It also has the two spots, but the tip gives the story away. That probably will be your main way of telling them apart at a glance. Very difficult in flight, like I say, you cannot really determine them in flight. Unless, of course, it's landed, and then you see the dark veins. Now, the dark veins, the underside is actually yellow, and these dark veins, if you look very closely, they're not green at all. It's actually made up of a mixture of yellow and black. So if you get a chance to see the underside, you cracked it. But that doesn't happen that very often. You're quite often relying on seeing it more in this kind of pose, if you're lucky and it stays still long enough. As you're walking, you are getting to see a number of them in a landed position, and then you can actually do the ID that we've just described. While you're doing that, just make a note in your mind what the proportion of each is. So it might be 50-50. It might be 25-75. It might even be 100%. An example would be when you move from open sunny into shade, you need to check your proportions because likely as you go into shade, most of them are going to be green vein whites. So the proportion method works great until the conditions change. Okay, you need to check that every time you walk, and you need to check it as you're going through your sections just to make sure that those proportions are not changing. So the next white that flies past you, you can tell whether you separate out the large whites and the brimstones. You then left with the small whites and the green vein whites. And then you do, if it's 50-50, you do one small white, one green vein white, one small white, one green vein white. It is impossible to do any other method. And that is the most accurate way that you can do it. So calibrate your head, as it were. Because that's the business we're in. We're in the business of recording everything. It's important that we record everything, but we're making that best guess. Just to make life a little bit more complicated, then you have the orange tip, which of course the female. Here's the male in its characteristic tips. But of course it has its habits. And it's very much prefers damp areas where its food plant garlic mustard grows. And you see them more in a woodland areas than you will in open areas. Males are very distinctive. They wander a great deal, trying to find females. But the distinguishing mark, which I'll point out now is the male has a very small black spot just on the edge of the orange. The female has a pretty large, and it's always dark, it's always black, and it's near that top edge and roughly in the middle. You also notice that the wings are a different shape from the whites that we've just been looking at. The wing tips are round, and they're also checkered, but they are quite a deep shade of black. And that differentiates it from the green vein white, where that would be much more diffuse. It would be broken up, and you have that characteristic black spot and the checkerboard. It's also slightly smaller than all the other whites, so it's the smallest of our whites. And of course, what we all enjoy seeing is that wonderful patterning on the back. Isn't it just absolutely gorgeous when you just stop for a second and just admire that intricacy? And when you see it sat on cow parsley, you begin to realize that that is an exact mimic of a cow parsley flower. It's a cracking mimic. And if you also look really closely, because it's a lady, she has yellow eyeliner. You need a really good close-up shot, but it's absolutely gorgeous. Again, this color is not green, it's actually yellow and black. That's the same for both sexes. And look at the difference between the green vein white and it's not difficult to get those two separated, I think. Quite different patterning. So the tip is, it's smaller than a green vein white, round wing tips, and look for that spot, that characteristic spot in the middle of the female's forewing. That is absolutely diagnostic. That was a pretty deep dive into whites, but from our last meeting, that was the one that people really wanted to get their heads around, is how the heck do you do whites? I hope I've managed to answer some of the questions.
I have a question actually.
Okay, Stella?
Stella. You were talking about the proportion method.
Yes.
Did I understand correctly that if you see something that you think could be a small white or a green veined white,
Yeah,
you just say, well, that's a small white, and then the next one's a green vein. So you just say, if you say 10, you say 5 was one and 5 was the other.
roughly. It's all matter of roughly. I do 0, 25, 50, 75 is my kind of proportions. And I base that number basically on what I'm seeing. So the ones that are actually settled, that I can actually determine what they are by the methods we've described. After I've seen 4 or 5, I know roughly what the proportion is in that section. So if I get in 25%, then I'll be in favor of green vein whites, which would be typical of a shady area. Then it would be 3 of them would be green vein white, and the next one would be a small white, small white. And I would keep that proportion, unless, of course, I'm only using it as the ones that I cannot firmly identify. I'm not using it for every single insect, only for the ones that I can't identify. They're just going too fast, don't settle, etc. So
Right.
I only apply the proportions to the ones that I can't definitely identify.
Right.
Okay, so it is quite a concept to get your head around to begin with, I think. And it's the first time I've talked about it on any of these. For a lot of people, it's kind of automatic. Well, I didn't identify it. I'm seeing 50-50. It must have been a small white. People kind of do it automatically in their head.
Yeah.
And it should
Right.
be almost automatic in your head without thinking about it.
Okay. I'm sure I'll
It's
get there.
what I would do, and what a lot of people do, is actually at this time of the year, as the first orange tips come out, you've got green vein whites and you've got orange tips. Can you spot the difference between the orange tip female and the green vein whites? There'll be small whites along in another week or so, and then it'll be a good chance to get out in the garden, actually practice those skills.
Hmm.
So you have a look at it and make your best guess, and then you chase it down and actually do an ID.
Hmm.
So you think it might be 50-50, you check two or three and just figure out, was I actually correct? Do I need to correct what I'm thinking? All right.
Okay. Yes.
But
Thank you very much.
you can't beat a bit of practice out in the garden, in my opinion. If you're new,
Right.
it's the kind of skills you learn in the first month, Stella. And
Right.
you do learn them really quickly. So
Okay.
don't worry, it will become automatic.
Right. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll move on.
Yeah,
And
I'd add there that you tend to you start the season where everything's gone out of your head because you've had 4 months off, and then you get your eye in and everything gets just a little bit easier. And then you will find also that on your own transect you will get to know the places where you're going to see these things and what you're likely to see in specific areas as well, just as you keep doing it. But particularly as the season goes on and you start to see them and then they build, and yeah, it does just come with experience, I think, sometimes. And we're
well,
always learning. You can have as much experience as you like, but we're still always learning.
I learned a lot just preparing this presentation. I have to be honest. I'm going to hand over to you now, Kerry, to do the dreaded skippers because those were the other family which people had the most difficulty with. Over to you.
Yeah, I've taken these on because they were my nemesis for quite a bit. I should add in here as well that Nairi says in the chat that binoculars are really handy. And they absolutely are, as well as a camera if you can have one. So large skippers. Um, so like small skippers, they tend to be in discrete colonies that are fairly small. So you'll find that they'll have preferences for particular areas on your transect. So for instance, in mine, they tend to favour down at the bottom of the bank in the longer, damper grasses. And on my transect, large skippers I will generally see in the brambly areas where they nectar on the flowers, and small skippers I'll see in other places. So you can start to build up an idea, as I was saying, of where you might see these species within your transect. Um, Large skippers, I generally see them when they're leaping off some sort of vegetation just as you're walking by, but they're extremely fast, really hard to keep track of. So they'll leap off and you'll spend quite a bit of time looking around thinking, what was that and where did it go? And usually the answer is no idea. Um, but they tend to be easy to differentiate from the smaller skippers because they have this. Nick, could you just hover over the wings? They have this checkered marking on the wings. And that's generally what I'm using to try and differentiate, as well as the way that they fly. So large skippers will emerge earlier in the year, so you're expecting them in June. So you have a bit of time, you've got about 2 weeks before the small skippers then turn up. So it's a great opportunity for you to spend a bit of time familiarising yourself with their jizz, the way that they behave and the way that they fly, because it is slightly different from the small skippers, which I find still dart about, but it's just, I would describe it as more gentle. I think, yeah, just a gentler. So they'll leap about and dart from vegetation to vegetation, but it tends to be more localized. So you can keep track of them a little bit easier. Yeah, there's a great example at the bottom of the checkered pattern that you see on the top of the wing. And in the small and Essex skippers, it's just a plain wing. And I think that's the easiest way to tell them apart if you can do that in conjunction with the flight. I would really recommend, if you can, taking a camera out. This is the easiest way I've figured out to really learn the difference between large and small skipper and how to just really nail that identification. You can also do it by antennae. So in the large skipper, they're pointed, where in the small skipper, they're rounded. But you're needing to you're either going to have to get very close, and it's fairly impossible to do that, or yeah, you're going to have to take a load of pictures. That's generally the method I've used. Let me just check the chat. Yeah, definitely take a field guide. NHBS one's really good. It's got three or four pages that's fold out. I have mine with me all the time. Really helpful for if you spot something but you're not quite sure. And loads of pictures. So small and Essex, we tend to group together. I don't have Essex on my transect, so it's not a species I'm particularly familiar with. So again, you'll see from this that really blank pattern. So again, very bright yellow, and the size between the large and small and Essex skippers is fairly negligible, even though they're called small and large. They like to keep us on our toes and confuse things. But it's really that colour that you're going to notice if you can get up close, and the flight pattern. So as it says there, they like the rough tall grassland as well, and also exist in discrete colonies. And again, you'll find that the flight is darting and they skip about, but it's just, as I said, slightly gentler, so a little bit easier to track. And like the large skipper, they also keep their wings half open at rest. Yeah, so you'll see the large skipper first in June, and then 2 weeks after that you'll start to see the small skippers, and then 10 days after that, roughly, if you have Essex skippers, you'll start to see them then. I think the only real way to tell between the Essex and the small skipper is using the antennae. And you're absolutely going to need a camera or binoculars for that. And yeah, really cooperative butterflies. So you're looking for in the Essex skipper, you'll see it's just got his cursor on it there. Their antennae look like they've been dipped in paint or ink. So it's a very black tip, whereas in the small skipper, it's orange tipped. So those two pictures are quite good at giving you that distinction. They also do have these sex or scent brands. In the large skipper, they're quite large and chunky. And in the small skipper, they're fairly slim and quite short. And in Essex, they're slim again, but angled and quite long. So as Nick's put here, on sites where you have large, small, and Essex, the easiest way to tell them apart is that a large skipper will have the checkered upper wing, whereas small and Essex won't. And if you're really not sure, use Nick's suggestion for proportions. Yeah, so that was a quick run through that. Any questions on the small and large skippers? I think these are ones that you really get your eye on. It took me 3 years to try and figure them out, of just taking photographs and getting frustrated and sending Nick emails saying, what's this? But you do just start to get a feel for the way that they behave in particular. So it's a really good if you have them to try and just get a handle on how the large skippers behave right at the start of the season. Right, so we'll have a look at dingy skipper. Dingy skippers are a bit of a speciality of the transect that I manage at Fordham. So I really like them. I think a lot of people think they're a bit dull and brown and boring, but I think they're really pretty. And I really like to champion them. So yeah, as Nick's put here, small, dull brown to grey, and a bit moth-like. So they also live in discrete colonies. So again, in your transect, you might find that they like to appear in particular areas. I've got particular areas in mind where I'm fairly guaranteed to see them. So they're very much in favour of open, sunny areas with a bit of bare ground where they can bask in the sunshine. They nectar on bird's foot trefoils, so you'll find them around anywhere that has that as well in any of the other trefoils. And I think they particularly like yellow plants. So I often see them nectaring on dandelions and celandines and things like that. In terms of flight, they're small and quite fluttery, but they're quite quick, so you can lose them quite easily. I always find that they're quite cooperative in that they'll often flutter around and then they'll settle. So it's sometimes quite easy to get right up to them and have a look for an ID, particularly again if you've got a camera or a pair of binoculars. And I've never seen it, but so in the daytime they'll rest with the wings out, but on a nighttime they'll sit on a blade of grass like this picture at the top and wrap their wings around the top. It's quite an impressive little feat. So just a single generation. So you'll start to see them in May time and early June. And then in terms of what they can be confused with, there's Mother Shipton and Burnet Companion. So Mother Shipton you can distinguish because they have that very distinct, quite contrasting wing pattern that looks a bit like a witch's face. And I find Mother Shipton tend to say, no, thanks very much, fly off and sit and flutter in grass that you just can't get to. And they're quite hard to really compare, really. And then the Burnet Companion has that yellow part of the underwing. So again, you should be able to differentiate. And they have a similar upper wing pattern, but they're just a bit more drab than the Dingy Skipper. I should also say that in dingies, they can, as they age, they can become quite drab and dull and really fade out, so they look quite worn. But they should still be distinguishable as a dingy skipper. And I'll also say that I found that I have quite a few brown Argus on my site, and I found that as they jump in the air and flutter off, if you disturb them, sometimes you might be a bit uncertain which is which, but brown Argus generally tend to have a silver flash as they're flying, which and dingies are a definite brown, so that's an easy way to tell them apart.
I have a question. I believe they fly quite low. Is that right, dingy skippers?
Yeah, they tend to stay low to the ground. Um, so I think it's fairly easy to keep track of them. They are quite quick and they can go quite far. But yeah, they'll tend to stay fairly close to the ground, sort of a foot or so off the ground. And I find often that I'll just disturb them as I'm walking along. So you walk along and they're quite hard to see in contrast to something like the small coppers, but they'll just leap up as you wander along, and it makes it quite helpful, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think a phone, it depends how close you can get. I think with something like the large and small skippers, it's quite hard to get close to them. So unless you've got quite a high-powered phone, you're probably going to need more of a dedicated camera. But with a dingy skipper, I think they're quite confiding and quite cooperative sometimes. So you can generally get close enough, I think, to use a phone camera. It's all trial and error. So yeah, go out and try it and see how you do. It's part of the fun of doing this, and it's fun. We want you to have fun. It's meant to be fun.
Could I just add, Kerry, if you're
Yep, go for it.
I would say of all the species, skippers tend to be under-recorded because people miss them because of their speed, particularly the large skipper, which is probably the fastest, smallest, seemingly fueled on jet fuel. They are so quick that people just miss them. And I would say they're the most commonly under-recorded. And it's well worth developing your skills of just picking up that little movement and to trying. I know it's difficult to sometimes determine that movement from, say, a fly, but butterflies do have that certain jizz, that certain thing, which is different from the fly. And yeah, large skippers are tricky. Small skippers, I think they also have this, like the females in particular like to fly between grass blades, and they jink along going in and out between grass blades as they're looking for a place to lay eggs, which makes it a little bit easier, while the males tend to sit somewhere and then ambush things that go past. Anyway, shall we continue? On to the browns. And I guess we've probably count more of these than any other, the meadow brown. And it's also very commonly misrecorded. And the simple reason is this chap. So above is you've got a female meadow brown, and below you've got a very typical early in the season when they're very fresh and still got that lovely white edge on them. They look exactly like ringlets, apart from that little bit of brown. But there is this eye spot, which is the giveaway, which you don't see very clearly. On the top side of a ringlet, you do not see clearly the eye spots. So, and also the males occur earlier than the females. So easily mistaken with a faded ringlet, as you can see. The males, as I was saying, appear first and resemble ringlets because they are very dark. And the brown around the eyes is very variable. Bit more consistent in the female, which is a paler color and has generally darker, a larger, more orangey marking around the eye spot. So a single black eye spot. We're into the spots now, and we're looking at the pupil, that white bit in the beginning. So the idea of eye spots is, if you're an attacking bird, which bit do you bite off first if you're a bird? You bite off the head, which has the eye on. So it's trying to kill it quickly by biting off an eye. So, and really a butterfly can still fly quite happily with a bit missing. And you quite often, within a few days of butterflies emerging, you'll see tears and wear from bird strikes. Quite often you see the shape of the beak where it struck a butterfly. So spots are a good protection. Females are larger, paler, and more variable orange marks, which we just said. Fairly long flight season, so they start in June, usually first half of June, and will carry on into August. Now, the caterpillars develop at different speeds, and if it's extremely hot, like it was this last June, then a proportion of the caterpillars in the extreme heat will actually hibernate, wait till it gets a little bit cooler, and then come back out again. So you get quite a spread of emergence, and it more affects the females, which they're larger and they tend to be later. So as you go south of the country, you find more meadow browns appear in August than they do in Yorkshire. And that's because of this this diapausing of the caterpillars in the heat. So it's found in places with long grass. It's always in full sun, which is somewhat unlike the ringlet. These are sun-loving butterflies. They rarely go near the shade. And the big distinguishing mark, really, which counts them apart from the ringlet, is the forewing underside is very deep orange. So when it's in flight, compared with the ringlet, it is orangey compared with the more grey-brown and also smaller ringlet. So that's the big tip with these two species. In other words, if you see any shade of orangey brown at all when it's flying, it's a meadow brown. And it's because of this underside. So the ringlet is smaller, is darker, although it goes paler as it gets older. Eye spots are not very visible. It usually frequents damp, grassy areas, sometimes in part shade, and you can get them in a wide range of habitats. It's a relatively recent addition to the Yorkshire list. You don't have to, they really began to move in the 1990s. So it's only been on a lot of our transects for less than 30 years. It also is capable of flying under cool and overcast conditions, sometimes even flying in drizzle and rain, light rain, and it will fly much later into the day. Distinctive slow flight, it's called jinking, where it's going between grass blades. So it closes its wings to get between the grass blades and then flaps, jink, flap, jink, flap, jink, like so. If you see that movement, that generally will be a ringlet. It can resemble a male meadow brown, but note that the edge of the wing, when it's fresh, is white. But it is that white edge is lost as they get older. Single generation, but it has a short flight period compared with the meadow brown. So from late June, so it's usually a week after the first meadow brown, and then it flies to only into very early August, and then they're gone. Unlike the meadow brown, which carries on for some weeks more. So the tip is, if it's dark in flight, slightly smaller than the meadow brown, no sign of orange in flight, it's a ringlet. Of course, the big characteristic, if you're not quite sure, wait for it to land, have a look at the underside, and you've got the characteristic rings of the ringlet. Now, the gatekeeper, otherwise known as the hedge brown. You can use either. It's first of all, the thing to say, it's much smaller, and the eye spot has two pupils. And the most important thing which I use to determine them, because they're in flight, is it is very much more reddish orange than the meadow brown. Some people call them the little fox because of its reddishness. And it is quite a red brown. It loves certain flowers. It loves brambles, in particular, marjoram. And the reason is it only has a very, very short proboscis. It can't reach nectar on most flowers. It's quite restricted on what it can take nectar from. It goes to the tall grasses, and surprisingly, it always seems to be near gateways, hedges, woodland rides, etc. And of course, it doesn't inhabit the whole of Yorkshire. The line is, it doesn't quite reach you, Carrie, does it? Or only a very few?
I've had one ever.
One ever.
Yeah.
But if you go to 20 miles south, they are abundant. It's kind
Yeah,
of
so where is it? If you go to Top Hill Low Nature Reserve, they've got a
yes,
lot there, and that's not that far away.
or even Warren Percy, which is also on the wolds and the same kind of habitat as you. They have good numbers.
Yeah, I'm hoping for some.
So one generation. So tip is, if it's small and then a hint of reddish brown, it's only can be one thing. It's a gatekeeper. Underside is very attractive. You see the double pupil and some more white spots.
So Nick, we've got a couple of comments coming. So Nairi says that they have them in Lower Wharfdale, but not in Upper Wharfdale. My geography is absolutely hopeless, so I'm not entirely sure where Wharfdale is. And Tamsin asks, could you explain exactly where the line is?
It's kind of a diagonal line from maybe south of Bridlington, up the Howardian Hills, and Ripon. It's present, and then it goes up the valleys, as Nairi was saying. It does go up the valleys, but not always all the way up the big river valleys of Yorkshire, so the Wharfe, the Nid, etc. But it's very much more widespread in the southern half of the county. It's almost universal across the Vale of York. Does that answer the question? I hope.
I've just pasted a link to the Butterfly Conservation website that if you scroll down on that page, it shows you a bit of a distribution, which gives you a bit of an idea of what Nick's talking about.
Yeah, that line hasn't changed, surprising with global warming. It hasn't changed dramatically, although you get wanderers even up onto the North York Moors. In terms of abundance, that is about the line. Below that line, they're quite abundant, if not very abundant. Above that line, they're almost non-existent. You get wanderers, as Kerry gets on her transect. So you could probably get wanderers almost anywhere. So it's something to watch out for wherever you are.
Tamsin asks as well, would it be likely to occur around Settle area?
The lower parts, probably the low. If it's really down in the lowlands, yes. But I think we're dead on the line at Settle. That's a bit way up the. Depends on altitude. I would say anything less than 100 meters might have a chance. Anything more than 100 meters, no chance at all. By the way, 100 meters is about 1 degree centigrade, and I think that's what we're talking about here. It's a small difference in temperature. I'll move on to the speckled wood, if I may. This is a really interesting species. Dark chocolate brown, flecked with yellow, creamy spots. That color changes a little bit through the seasons. Males defend sunspots, and sunspots are our big friend because sunspots enable us to find this little blighter in woodland. If you passed a shadow through that sunspot, it will always take off. And usually, if it takes off, there'll be 3 or 4 of his mates will spot that one insect take off, in which case you then get a spiral fight go on. So they spiral upwards and gather more speckled woods as they go. But it's also always that sunspot resident speckled wood returns to his spot. The others just diffuse away, and the resident returns to his spot to stand guard. Its life history is quite complicated. So you have 3 overlapping generations, all the way from March to October. But they overwinters both pupae and caterpillar. So you get a somewhat staggered generations. So at the moment, and it's quite surprising at the moment, the reports coming in from our transects are quite startling. People are getting more than double the number they normally get at this time of the year. I had one report of 30 from a graveyard, which is nearly double the normal what you see at this time of the year. They've had a big hatch, and the reason is they're hatching from pupae, and because of the warm weather, they've all hatched together. They'll live for about a week, and then they'll be replaced with butterflies which are hatching from caterpillars, which overwintered. So you get this kind of double peak in each generation. It gets more and more blurred as you go through the year. And the result is you can see speckled wood now, I would say every week throughout our season. There'll be dips, but you can see them throughout the season. It loves grassy vegetations, woodlands, but it also likes, and this is a big change really in its behaviour, which happened around about again about 30 years ago. It switched from being a woodland species to being a species of hedgerows and shady areas. So around where I live, it's extremely common on field edges if there's a little bit of shade. That's all it needs. For a few hours during the day, it gets a bit of shade from the surrounding trees. It's enough for it to breed on. And the numbers of speckled we're seeing these days compared with 20 years ago is much bigger. It's probably is going to rival meadow brown before long as our most abundant species. The larvae feed on grasses, and the adults feed on honeydew. So this is the sticky sugar that comes from the rear end of an aphid. So if you've got sycamore trees which are prone to getting aphids, and the leaves underneath get sticky, they are basically feeding on the honeydew from feeding aphid, which of course are very common. And there's a tip I can give you on the flight, and it's quite characteristic, the flight of a speckled wood. is it'll beat and then it will glide. And when it glides with the wings in a V shape. So if you're following one, you'll see a beat, glide, beat, glide, and you see that V shape, and it's very characteristic speckled wood. I mean, the color is fairly obvious, but just to double check, if you see that characteristic flight, you've cracked it. And I always check when I'm walking, I always check my sunspots. And I would give this as number one tip: check your sunspots for sitters. I call a sitter as an insect that is perched. And as I'm walking, you must keep to your route, but I always allow my shadow to go across any sunspots if I can. If it's reasonable, I can just move to one side of my path, cast a shadow through a sunspot. That's usually enough to bring up an insect. And it's surprising. Most sunspots on my transect are guarded by speckled woods. So this is the underside, quite plain. You got the eye spot. Now moving on to, and this is our smallest brown species, the small heath. It's declining and it's now threatened in the UK. But still, fortunately, in Yorkshire, it's still pretty common. Always sits motionless with its wings closed. It aligns itself to the sun, so there's no shadow. That's another little characteristic some of the brown species have of not getting eaten by birds is as soon as you land, turn so you have no shadow. In flight, it's a fawny orange color. Unlike the color you see here on its wing, and I'll show you why in a minute, the flight is very weak, fluttery, erratic, and usually very close to the ground. As soon as it lands, it tends to disappear for the reasons above. It has one pupilled eye spot, and you also see this little light squiggle here. It's quite distinctive and makes it different from other species. Colonies tend to be small. They're found on rough, often tusky grassland of commons, heaths, brownfields, and moorlands. So quite a range of different grassland habitats. There are two overlapping generations in Yorkshire, one starting in May and the other towards the middle of July. But they tend to overlap. There's only a small gap between them. Just so you, if nobody's ever seen one, and very few people have ever taken a photograph of a small heath with its wings open, this poor chap fell into a puddle. And the photographer managed to get a photo of it in its prostrate condition to show us exactly why it looks the color it does. And that is the color that you see when it's flying, is that topside color. It's just a fawny brown. I'm going to hand now to Kerry for her species, the wall brown.
Excellent, thank you, Nick. So wall brown, often abbreviated to wall. So sadly, a bit scarce really from Lonely in Yorkshire since 2010. I'm just pasting the corresponding page on the Butterfly Conservation site so that you can see the distribution again. Because if you have a look at that, you'll see where the gaps are. So we can still see them in colonies along the coast and the moors and the uplands. So I have them on my transect on the edge of the moors. But yes, sadly vacant from the lowlands in recent years. But good news is that they seem to be coming back. So worth keeping an eye out for them and quite hard to miss them. So wall are very strong flyers. Often you'll just see a flash of this fantastic orangey brown colour. They're quite distinctive with that the eye and those markings. There's nothing really like them apart from the dark green fritillary. You will generally see them in rough grassland and on again like some of the species on patches of bare soil where they like to bask and sit and just absorb the sun, like many of us. Males are, I would describe them as argumentative thugs. They like to patrol up and down and defend their territory, and they'll often chase females and fly about into the air. But yes, really strong flyers. So 2 generations. So you'll first see them in May and June, and then again in July and September. And then occasionally, when we're really lucky, we might get a 3rd generation in October. So females are larger and their markings are narrower. So that's quite a nice distinction. Could you just flash back and forth again between those, Nick? Yeah, so the males are just a bit smaller and the markings are just slightly chunkier. Their underside, as you can see here, has these fantastic concentric circles. I think that's a beautiful undermarking. Not dissimilar to the way that the orange tip is marked. Different, obviously, but just that almost speckledy. With wall, they're similar in size to the gatekeeper, but where the gatekeeper is just generally quite orangey, they have that really distinct patterning, so you can generally tell, and obviously that really strong flight. You're more likely to confuse them with the dark green fritillary. Also a species that's very strong flight and looks like it might beat you up if it bumped into you. But where wall of a fairly sort of medium-sized butterfly, dark green fritillary are very large. And again, with your transect, you'll get a feel for where you might see these species. So for instance, with mine, I know that I'll see dark green fritillary generally in sections 8 and 9. So if I'm seeing something like this that's flying by me very quickly and it's bright orange and I'm not entirely sure, on balance of probability, it's probably a wall brown if it isn't in the area I'm expecting to see dark green fritillary. So yeah, you're looking for the markings and the size to differentiate between the dark green fritillary. So I will now hand back to Nick for the beautiful marbled white.
Thank you. Yes. No wonder it's the symbol of Yorkshire butterfly conservation. It's a beautiful thing, but it's not white. It is actually a brown. It's a brown with white markings. So don't think of it as a white. So unmistakable checkerboard, and you can see the checkering in flight. And the reason it's checkered is warning to birds that I am poisonous. It has some pretty potent alkaloid poisons that it actually gets from a fungus. So the reason you get it on some meadows, not on other meadows, is the female will not lay eggs unless she smells the fungus, which is the ergot fungus, which is famous because it has a black bodies that stick out of the where the grass seed was going to be. You get a black body of an ergot. And that's what the female is trying to find, because that indicates that the fungus is present, and therefore my progeny will be protected by the poison. And I'm going to tell the whole world that I'm poisonous by being this startling, wonderful marbled colour. Colonies tend to occur in medium height and improved grasslands, and of course particularly the limestone areas like the wolds. And it can be extremely numerous. So if you go up into the wolds in July, it can be easily the most numerous species. But in recent times, it's become well established on the limestone ridge, which is roughly where the A1 is. In other words, just off the Vale of York, runs north-south, and the Tabular Hills, which is the line of hills on the south edge of the North York moors, which are chalk. It's the only bits that are chalk, is where the rivers have cut through and exposed the chalk. Significant spread in recent years. It's beginning now to appear on neutral grasslands around York, You don't think of York as being a place you would see marble white, but it's actually quite common. Only in very low numbers, 1s, 2s, 3s or 4s, railway embankments, road embankments, fields and parks. I've even had it in my garden, which is in the middle of agricultural wilderness in the middle of Vale of York. So they are actively colonizing the Vale of York. And if they find a suitable grassland, they are colonizing. So wanderers are very common. So watch out for those. Larvae feed at night, one generation, which lasts from mid-June to mid-August. The female is how you tell them apart is the female is very light coloured compared with the male, dark coloured on the underneath. And in the adult, this is a female, it's very slightly creamy coloured. That's how you tell the sexes apart. And that's the end of the browns. So I'll ask for questions at that point. Let's carry on to the coppers, the blues, and the hair streaks, the Lycinids family. First up is quite unique. It's a very small, very beautiful, red in colour in flight, a more warm buff colour, which is the underside when it's in shadow. But it's our only red butterfly, which is really, really red. Active, erratic, fast flying, difficult to follow because of its typical hair streak, lycinid behavior. It's very fast and it changes direction quite quickly. Quite often flies high, and you're quite often seeing it barrel rolling down a woodland ride, and it is quite common in woodlands. Basks in the sun with open wings. And the female, how you tell the sexes apart is this is a female. The spots are small and its body is a bit more chunky. And the band here is quite narrow, while the male, this is wide, the spots are bigger. You also see sometimes little blue spots here, just above the bottom here, which is a different form of the same species. You can write it down on your recording form as a note, and out of interest. So it's a species of rough grassland, heath, brownfields, other open places where there's sorrel. Small discrete colonies, it's not uncommon, it's a pretty mobile species, rarely occurs in any big numbers. I suppose when I'm counting on transects, I suppose a count of 2 or 3 would be quite common. There are some transects where they can get up to 40, 50. That tends to be in the northern parts of the county, up on the hills, upland areas, particularly places like Swaledale and Catterick. You can get extraordinary numbers of common blues, 50, 100 in one area. 3 generations, May, June, July and August, September, October. And the last one tends to be the biggest generation. Then the parasites set in, and it's an egg parasite, and then the numbers crash the following year. So our tip is it's our only small red butterfly, and you see that colour in flight. I'm going to hand back to Kerry now for the common blue.
Excellent, thank you very much, Nick. Another beautiful butterfly. So common blue, so males are very conspicuous compared to females. So they have this wonderful bright blue colour, and you'll often see them flying around looking for a mate. So they occur in colonies, and they tend to hang around on the short grassland, so particularly on limestone or rough ground. And again, they're like bird's foot trefoils, so you're looking for short sward areas with bird's foot trefoil, open bare areas. 2 generations. So the first generation flies in May to June, and then you're likely to see a fresh generation again in October, December to September time. Females tend to be quite variable, so they can be very brown with just a little bit of blue, quite like the brown Argus. Or they can be quite distinctively blue and easy to tell apart. They have, like the brown Argus, they have these orange lunules. So when you're trying to differentiate between the two, you're really looking for that hint of blue that you can use to distinguish. You can also do it by the underside, but it's quite tricky. And you're looking for figures of eights and spots that aren't there. I think we'll get onto that in a second. So you might also mistake the common blue male for the holly blue. So the difference here is that a holly blue comes out, it emerges earlier, and it prefers to fly around bushes, trees, shrubs, much higher, whereas common blue tend to stay low to the ground and again prefer open grassland with short sward. So and yeah, you can just see on that picture Nick's pointing to, a holly blue will have this checkered fringe. So if you're lucky enough to be able to get close enough, that's another way to differentiate. But the top tip is, if it's flying around in open grassland, fairly low, it's a common blue. And if it's hanging around the shrubs and the trees and it's flying a little bit higher, it's likely to be a holly blue. Brown Argus, another of my favourite butterflies. I think these little things add such beauties. So Brown Argus, when they're flying about, I think I mentioned earlier, in comparison to the dingy skipper, they have this glinty silvery appearance. It's really quite distinctive and quite hard to miss. So you'll just see a flutter of something that looks silvery and know you've got a Brown Argus. They have this beautiful rich brown colour on the upper wings and lower wings, and then these fantastic orangey lunules. And again, you can see there that's a brown Argus, and in contrast to the female common blue, where you just see that hint of blue. Again, they like to hang around on bird's foot trefoils, so just to confuse things a bit. So there are two forms of brown Argus, because one would just be far too simple for us to deal with. So the common form, which I think I have on my transect, feeds on geranium, so dove's foot, crane's bill, and it's transient. And there's a scarcer form that lives in large colonies on limestone, where you're likely to find rock rose.
Yeah, yours is the rock rose form.
So I've got the rare form then.
You've got the rare form, and most of us have to put up with the common ones. We didn't have these up till probably 20 years ago. There was only the scarce form in Yorkshire, and this form, the cranesbill form, has moved in, and in some places, crossed and pushed out the scarce form. They're almost impossible to tell apart from the food plant. And the reason they've become very common is dove's foot cranesbill is an agricultural weed, and it grows in that little strip at the edge of fields, which gets sprayed but then is left bare soil, is the perfect place for the cranesbill to get a hold. So for that reason, because they're so regularly sprayed with pesticide, the colonies are transient. So some people call it the migratory brown Argus, while yours at Fodden, Kerry, is the scarcer. You get hundreds, while most of us will only see a handful, even at best a handful, most because they spend so much time moving. But they are incredibly common because you see them everywhere. Down on the lowlands, they are literally everywhere, and really easily confused with common blues, mostly because they sit together, they nectar together, they'll go and sit on bird's foot trefoil together, and when you get these two forms here side by side, you begin to see the reason for that confusion. Anyway, I've said enough, Kerry. This is your baby. I'm going to hand back.
No, thank you. You're far much better at this than me.
I thought
Um,
I thought I'd just do the lowland viewpoint of it, which is quite
no,
different
that's
from probably your viewpoint.
yeah, that's great. I should say that we aren't trying to distinguish between the two different
No,
types.
no,
We're
no.
just happy to record brown Argus. So don't worry about that at all. Where are we? So yeah, so as Nick says, you'll see a fantastic comparison there where the brown Argus on the left, definite blue of the female, common blue on the right. So yeah, your top tip for differentiating the brown Argus from the common blue is if it looks like the specimen on the left, if it's chocolate and orange, oh chocolate orange, and has no blue, it's a brown Argus, and if it's got that hint of blue, it's a female common blue. But if you can get close enough to see the underwing, really nice way of telling. So on the left, you can see circled that figure of 8, and something that brown Argus have, but common blue definitely don't. And then in contrast, on the right, common blue have this additional spot on the base of the forewing, sort of if you like the butterfly shoulder. Um, and brown Argus don't have these. Yes, you're definitely going to need to be very up close and personal with them, or taking a photograph and looking at that. And holly blue, another beautiful butterfly. So like I said earlier, you usually see holly blues fluttering around trees, shrubs, and bushes. So they tend to be much higher off the ground than their similar common blue species. So they have this fantastic violet blue upper wing, and on the underwing they've got this silvery blue with these small black dots. So quite different to the common blue. And yeah, as Nick has written here, there's not a hint of orange or brown. So very different from the female common blue as well. The female has a broad dark margin, and as you can just see, as Nick's pointing out, they've got these checkers as well. So really, again, quite distinctive. So they're not colonial, so they wander about. You can find them all over the place, and they'll occur in small numbers near their food plants. So they have a regular 3 to 5 year cycle, and lucky them, they're the sole host of the parasitic wasp Lystrodomus nicephorus. Yeah, that's my attempt at that. 2 generations of them. So you'll first see them in April to June, and then you'll see them in July and September. And so in April to June, they'll lay their eggs on holly. And just for a bit of a change, in July to September, they'll lay their eggs on ivy. Is there a reason for that, Nick?
Yeah, it's because the caterpillars bore into the fruit. So they bore into the holly fruit to begin with, and then they bore into the ivy fruits as they develop. So it's the developing fruits that they're interested in. So they generally lay the eggs just behind the bud of a flower, or just at the base of a fruit. Yeah, but
Thank you.
they do actually, if they can't find the ivy, they just go straight for holly and carry on as normal. It's not a strict rule.
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it, really? Not putting your eggs in one basket, or your larvae. So they occur in gardens and parks right next to the centre of cities. So this is one I see in the garden quite a lot, which is quite nice in contrast to something like the common blue, which I definitely don't see in gardens. So your top tip for identifying a holly blue is if it's blue and it's hanging around trees, shrubs, and hedges, and it's flying higher up, it's a holly blue. It's nothing else, it's a holly blue. And if it's on the ground in open spaces, it's a common blue. Right,
Okay.
back to Nick for another gorgeous butterfly.
Okay, we're going to go over to the hair streaks now. And the reason it's called a hair streak, this is the green hair streak, is it has these lines on. And there's a lot of butterflies have these lines on their underside, and they're usually associated with forest dwellers. But I'll explain a bit more about that later. So the green hair streak is generally an upland species, North York moors, Pennines, usually on millstone grits, sometimes on limestone, occasionally on lowland heath and brownfields, and sometimes in quarries. It has a very big range of habitats, and it feeds on different plants in different habitats. So it has this unmistakable bright green on the underside, dull brown on the upper side. When it's flying, it's very hard to detect, and I quite often confuse it with large flies, which are also brown. They always rest with their wings closed and show the green, if you can find the green on the green plant. It's very clever camouflage, and almost exact match for the vegetation. So if it lands, it is a tricky one to spot. You have to rely on that brown when it's flying to see it. Fortunately, the males will come up because they're quite territorial, while the females are searching for nectar. The food plants, bilberry, which is probably its most common food on the moors, gorses, sometimes heathers, and on the lowland it tends to be bird's-foot trefoil. One generation, mid-April, mid-June. First one's already been seen outside Leeds this year, and I think the first ones were seen at Otley. Otley Chevin is the hot spot. If you want to see one, you haven't seen one before, Otley Chevin, small brown, erratic flyer, and always near its food plant. So we move on now to the arboreal or the tree hair streaks. These are the most poorly recorded, no, not poorly recorded, just under-recorded butterfly. They're surprisingly common, but we don't often see them. And this particular one, the white letter hair streak, is regarded as scarce. And it has this wonderful W shape right here, which gives it its name of the white letter. And it has a streak of orange along the edge here. Brown in flight. It's always found close to elms, and it's usually wych elm, which is still quite common in Yorkshire. Everybody thinks that the elm trees all disappeared with Dutch elm disease. It's not true. Elm trees, in my opinion, are indestructible. If they die of Dutch elm, they send up a shoot from the bottom. A year or so later, and a new tree grows. It'll grow to 20, 30 foot, which is big enough for it to produce fruit, at which point the hair streaks move in, and then a few years later it will die off with the Dutch elm as soon as the beetle gets in. When's the best time to find them? Well, the best time to find them is right now. These next 2 weeks are the perfect time to find the elm trees. And the reason is it's fruiting, and these are actually the fruit of the elm. And what's it look like? It's quite characteristic, the elm tree, when it's in fruit, because it has no leaves, like most trees at the moment have no leaves, but it fruits before it has leaves. And it's this kind of silvery green. It shines in the sun. So if you're walking in woodland, watch out, because you'll see, with the wind which we've had today, these will be lying on the floor of the woodland track. And if you look up, you should be able to spot these chaps, which are the cimosas, the fruiting bodies of the elm. And this is typical of an elm, they shine in the sun, this silvery, very pale green color. And if you mark them in your head now, when you're on your transect, then there's always that chance when you come back in July when it flies, of seeing the insect. So the other hair streak is the purple hair streak, also very common, can be very numerous. And the way you tell it is it has this silver underside, also with that white streak. Now, almost universally amongst our arboreal tree butterflies have this streak. And we'll see a few more as we go through this presentation. There's a few more of them. They have, and the reason they do it is like wartime camouflage on ships, etc. You want to break up your shape when you're in partial shadow. If you have a big stripe across you, you are breaking up your outline, so it confuses the enemy. Like ship camouflage, you disrupt how an insect sees you by breaking it up, by having hard lines across. Almost every large oak tree, if it's in a sunny spot and you're in July, you will find them if you go at the right time of day. Both species are tricky to spot because they tend to be quite erratic in their flight, and it's generally very short flights around the tops of the branches near the tops of trees. They also tend to peak in their activity in the evening, i.e. when we're finished our transects, they come out to play. Both species feed on honeydew, and the main time you'll see them, which is surprising, is after wet weather, when all the nectar, when they come down to nectar, because the rain has washed all the honeydew off the leaves. So they're forced to come down to find food. But also, and this is very common, when it's extremely hot, you'll find them on the ground. And that's quite often where you find a colony, is you find a white letter hair streak sitting on the ground. Well, the vanillas are pretty easy because they're big and they're beautiful and they're huge and they're coloured. Painted lady will be familiar to many people. Always basks with its wings open. It's very fast. It's this lovely pinkish, salmony, orangey brown colour. Some people call them the pale pilgrims. They do come in very large numbers some years, about once a decade. They're coming up from south of the Sahara. Everybody thought they used to breed in North Africa. They don't. They go way down south, right down to the West African coast. They can't survive in our winter. Can be found open, sunny places. They do like hilltopping, waiting to find a mate. People at the tops of hills tend to see them more than people at the bottom. First migrants arrive in spring. So if it's very large, very fast, and pinkish in flight, the chances are it's a painted lady. Speed and size, pink. Red Admiral. Okay, very characteristic, that red stripe on our buddleia bushes. It's a migrant, very strong flyer, a large butterfly, distinctive diagonal red band across those forewings. It's now able to survive our warming winters by hibernating as an adult, and even as a caterpillar on the south coast, it now overwinters actually as a caterpillar. Undersides are dull with a salmon pink bar. Lays its eggs on common nettle, and you quite often will see them if there's a lot of them around, you'll see leaf tents in the tops of nettles, like they've woven the nettle together. Spring migration comes from Europe. Most of the ones we get are European, and the brood really builds up when we get to July. Numbers really begin to build up with migrants. And you see them on rotting fruit and ivy flowers when we get to September. So in flight, how you tell them, it's large, it's nearly black in flight, but those white bands here, you can see as it flies, usually, and that's how you tell it from other species. Small tortoiseshells you'll be familiar with. It's common, mobile, and it is also a migrant. Can almost be seen any month of the year, overwinters adults. The important bit is the ground colour is orange and the fringe is blue. So it has black and yellow stripes along the top side of its wing, quite characteristic of a tortoiseshell. And the hibernations begin to breed around about now. They are looking to lay eggs around this week and the next couple of weeks. They make communal larval webs, So it's the smallest of all our venecid species. It's very fast, purposeful flight and appears orangish in flight. That's how you tell it. That's the underside. Dark because it's a hibernator, so it gives it some protection when it finds a resting spot on the tree trunk, etc. All our hibernators tend to share that. Unless you're a brimstone, you go on the backside of an ivy or a bramble. Peacock, it's got those characteristic big eyes, and for good reasons. It's very common, particularly woodlands, can be seen a large part through the year, has this black underside camouflage. Large eye spots resemble the eyes of an owl. If you look very closely, that is an owl's eye. It also flashes. So when it's you see the underwings there, when it's challenged, it will open its wings very suddenly, like so. When it opens its wings, it hisses. It's our only hissing butterfly. And basically, it's making out as if I'm an owl. So the overwintering adults appear in February, but those same butterflies can be seen all the way into June. They're very long-lived. Black larvae with white dots live in webs, and they begin to emerge to the new generation in late July. And they feed up and hibernate, sometimes very quickly, which is confusing because you might only see them for a week or less in very hot weather because they feed up very quickly and then hibernate. They can wake again, but if it's very warm weather, they tend not to. But if they do come out, they'll continue to fatten up ready for winter. Experiencing booms and busts, we've just gone through a bust year, but it's good to see that numbers this year are very much better. So coming out of hibernation this year is actually good numbers, better than previous years. So if it's a strong flyer, a large, dark butterfly, which is very slightly that maroon color, when it's in the sun, you know you're looking at a peacock. Even if you can't see the eyes, you'll see that maroon color. So the comma, more complicated species, fascinating species. It's common, mobile, usually seen in ones and twos, but you find larger numbers in our woodlands. And it has these unique ragged edges. Looks so tatty, but that is on purpose because it's camouflage. And the underside has this characteristic comma mark, the C of the underside wing. Emerged in spring, and males are extremely territorial. They'll come up and greet you. So if you go into their territory, they see you, they'll come up, they'll instantly fly. So it gives you a clue. If one flies, usually 2 or 3 more will fly, and suddenly you've got a small cloud of them as they jostle. They use nettles, but they also use elms. So if you have a lot of elms in your woodland, you'll see more commas. The summer adults emerge in early June, but they have 2 forms, which is interesting. They have a pale form that breeds, and they also have a regular, like the one on the picture there, which goes on and hibernates, but doesn't breed. So it tends to be more golden brown than orange of tortoiseshell. So in flight, that's the way to tell them apart. It's not orange, it's just a more browny orange. You also get them confused with silver wash fritillaries, which I have a lot of on my particular transect. But the comma is much smaller, and it's generally a lot faster, and it has no grace at all, unlike the silver washed. So here's the second form. It's called Hutchinsoni, and it's pale. And not many people record them, but you can see here that the raggedness is much less. The spots are smaller, and the color is brighter. And depending on temperatures, you get more or less of these. It's kind of insurance policy. If it's a warm, beginning of summer is warm, they produce more of these, which then leads to another generation, so numbers build up. So it's kind of an insurance policy. This is the dark green. It's our most widespread fritillary, but it's quite restricted in its habitat to limestones, Craven limestones, Ingleborough, that kind of area settle. Tabular Hills, which is the south side of the North York Moors, and the Limestone Ridge, like Brockadale is well known. And it's host generally on the calcareous grasslands, which is its preference, is hairy violet. So it's large, rapid, graceful flight. Hind wings have this characteristic silver spots on a green background, which is how it gets its name. It flies from mid-June into August. So this is my specialist species, Silverwash fritillary. I first arrived in Yorkshire about 2018 and bred up to quite big numbers in 2019 and spread out from there and now to inhabit quite a lot of our ancient woodlands, particularly along Tabular Hills, Vale of York, Limestone Ridge. Flies from beginning of July to about the middle of August. It's our biggest butterfly, a beautiful thing. Hard to describe as anything. It's a long-range wanderer as well, and you can see them. If you have a woodland, usually you'll get a visit, one visit per year. If you're lucky, you get to see that. It's agile and graceful. It's difficult to describe, but if you look at the underside, they have this pinkish underside with green and this silver flash, the characteristic of a woodland butterfly, the silver flash. And this is the female, which is quite different from male because the spots are bigger and the color is quite drab. But then if you're very lucky, you get to see this little devil. It's called Valacina, which is a blue-green form of the female. Quite rare, but in big colonies, and of which we have quite a number now in Yorkshire, you do get odd ones appear. A beautiful thing if you ever come across one. These are big butterflies. These are small plate size. They are quite enormous. Right, we'll move on. And we'll just very rapidly go through butterfly identification and the transect walk, because I know there's quite a few beginners here tonight, and I think we just need to run through the Pollard Walk, which is the basis of our UK BMS transects. So basically, we're counting everything that enters this 5-meter square in front of us. So not behind us, only in front of us. First thing we got to remember is a recording takes place once a week from 1st of April to the end of September. So 26 weeks. Any other data you record is interesting, but will not be used. Week 1 always starts 1st of April. Doesn't matter what day of the week it is. It can be a Wednesday, it can be a Sunday. This week it's handy because it starts on a Monday. So that's the butterfly week. We need to try and get a walk in between Monday and Sunday this week. And the weather forecast, I know it's been diabolical today. The weather forecast is a bit more hopeful for Saturday and Sunday this weekend. So if you can find some time to do your first walk this weekend, that would be great. We use a separate, what they call the F2 weekly recording form for each of these 26 recorded weeks. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. If you miss a week, keep going. Don't worry about it. Particularly this time of the year, April, it is very difficult. It's impossible to find the walk conditions. Transect counts should ideally be done between 10:45 and 3:45, between the hours 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Is okay in summer. Mornings are generally better than afternoons, especially when it's hot weather. Transect should always be carried out when it's warm, so it needs to be at least 13 degrees or more. This is the important bit. This is why we become obsessed with the weather forecasts. We're looking for that, and at least some brightness, so at least 60% sunshine. If it's overcast, it must be over 17 degrees and not raining, and preferably, always preferably, sunny. I know it's very difficult, and I take my hat off to all you walkers That one little sentence gives us the most maximum grief of any kind of occupation, I think, just getting those conditions. Even in July last year, those conditions were difficult. Now, there is a bit of flexibility. So for upland areas, you can walk at 11 degrees C, providing it's sunny. So we walk our transect at a slow, steady pace. We're counting all butterflies, all butterflies. And as I've said, you may need to use an intelligent guess, but we need to get something for everything you see. And it's within that distance, 2.5 meters either side, and 5 meters ahead, and 5 meters above us. We always follow the exact same route each time. We make the walk, and we know any sections we can't walk because of access issues, floods, etc. We make a note of those. We don't stop walking, and we definitely don't wait at our favored spots to improve our chances. That will bias your results. And the whole idea of this is it's a reproducible result. If I walk behind you, I should get the same numbers as you do. And when I have accidentally followed one of my walkers, it surprisingly is close, within 2 or 3 butterflies, which I find absolutely amazing. So for each section, we record butterfly numbers and the percentage sunshine. And how we do that? What is sunny? Well, you can use what they call the chocolate bar method. So if we divide in our head a section into 10 segments of a chocolate, every time we walk through a sunny part, we eat one section of our chocolate. When we get to the end of the section, we just note how many pieces of chocolate we've eaten. It's kind of a way of getting your head around how we do it. Most people do it in the head as a kind of running percentage. We're not asking for extreme accuracy, but make sure you get a figure for every section. Wind speed. Less critical, the low wind speeds. It gets critical when you've got wind speeds like we had today, when it's 30 mile an hour and more. In other words, blowing a park gale. If the wind speed is over Beaufort scale 5, and there's a description on the F2 form which gives you a guide as to that. If you're not sure what it is, it's dead easy to find out. If you've got your mobile phone with you, just Google in my location wind speed, and it'll tell you precisely what the wind speed is at that moment in time. So that's a little handy tip. And when I'm talking about the F2 form, I'm talking about this chap. Very good idea to fill this in when you're a beginner. Site name, recorder name, year, the date, the week number, the time you start, the time you finish. That's really important. They need to know the speed at which you're walking. So the distance is fixed, and these are 2 variables, the speed of your walk. The average temperature, I tend to, as I drive to the site, I look at my temperature on my car, and when I get back to the car, I look at the temperature again and take the average of the 2. Wind speed I've already done. Wind direction is optional, handy to know. And then you write down your different species, number in each of these are the sections across the top, and these use species down below. How most people do it is on a notebook, and they do it in groups of 5, and they put the dash, a horizontal, vertical line, and then after 4, the 5th one, you put a slash line through it. If you're very, very numerous, I count them in groups of 5 in my head to save on paper, make it easier. Just put 5 down, 5 down. It keeps it a very compact, so you can keep it on a small notebook then, rather than carry this big form around with you, which is a bit cumbersome.
So Julia asks, do you submit a record for a week that was too cold, etc.?
No. If you never find any walk conditions, then you record absolutely nothing. You just leave it blank. Please don't be tempted to walk in conditions which are not suitable, because they will immediately be disregarded by the other end. So you have to try and meet those conditions through part of your transect.
Can I just ask about something that I think I'm guilty of? Um, the transect that I walk, it should be lowland raised bog, but a lot of it is
Okay.
very tussocky, very rough.
Yes.
It's, some times of year, it's really hard just to stay upright on your feet as you walk
Yes.
it. And I don't think I do very well at looking up 5 meters
Okay.
because,
I
I'm
think I think
looking down to
I
see where
wouldn't.
I'm walking. Any tips?
Yeah. Rely on instinct. So your instinct, which comes as you develop your skills, Tamsin,
Mhm.
you suddenly and probably totally unaware that your peripheral vision becomes super sensitive to movement.
Right.
And I think I don't ever look up unless I'm looking particularly at looking for a hair streak, a purple hair streak or a white letter hair streak. I never bother to look up because I'm relying on my um, side vision, which is incredibly sensitive. As you record butterflies, I think it's one of those great feelings that you get is this heightened sense of awareness. So I wouldn't worry about it. You don't. I tend to just walk with my head going slightly side to side, like I'm watching Wimbledon, somewhat, but only a little bit. Only so my side vision, I cover the whole 180 degrees. Um, no, rely on your instincts, Tamsin. Don't worry about looking up. You don't need to. But
Okay, thanks. That's reassuring.
yeah, if you see movement and it looks like a butterfly, your brain will quickly compute, I think, that you should then alter your focus to something that's flying higher. So rely on your instincts.
So
Any other?
Nick, we've got a few more questions. So Ricky asks, how would you manage maintaining the speed of the transect walk if you are bombarded by lots and lots of butterflies?
That's a really good question, isn't it? The first rule is you've got to record everything. Develop shortcuts like I was describing with using your notepad and dashes and slash, put four vertical, then put a line through. You can almost do it without looking down. So you keep your eyes focused. The more time you can spend looking and the less time you spend writing, the better able you are to maintain your speed. But you will slow down. The important thing is you don't duplicate as you slow down because there is the temptation as there are more butterflies is there's more activity around you. There's more likelihood of double counting. So I classify them as bouncers, and you get patrollers going up and down. And if they're in large numbers, you need to have a strategy to deal with duplication. So I suffer with large numbers of silver wash fritillaries, which tend to go up and down and up and down, and brimstones that go up and down and up and down. And so if they're in large numbers, I only count them when they're coming towards me. So I'm not recording ones that are coming from behind me. By the way, you should never turn round to count the ones behind you. That's cheating. You can follow one with your eyes. So when it goes behind you, follow it to see what the ID is, but it must have flown through your box before you count it. That's the important thing. Bouncers. Bouncers and peacocks are devils, commoners are devils. Um, they'll land a few feet in front of you. You walk to them. They take off and they bounce to another spot about another 2 yards in front. Somehow you need to keep a mental note of those species that tend to do that, the bouncers. The Vanessids tend to be devils for it, just bouncing in front of you. It is a skill in that, and it's important that you keep moving forward because the more you move forward, the less likelihood that you're going to double count. So try and keep it steady. Try and find shortcuts with writing stuff. try and keep your eyes alert. Be aware of patrollers, be aware of bouncers, and keep going. That's the best I can do. There will always be a bit of duplication, but we're trying to minimize it.
Jeremy says he's new to this. Welcome, Jeremy, and hasn't done a transect before. So he gets the principles, but he's just wondering if it's possible to get out and go and have a walk around.
Yeah, if you want to join and just shadow somebody on a team, then it's up to me and you, me and Kerry, to put you in contact with a team and get you some experience. I think I know the Jeremy in question. Yeah, so very happy to put you in contact with the team there. They are actively looking for helpers, by the way, Jeremy. So it'd be great to have you on board. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Yeah, it's really helpful to get out and go around with somebody and just get it's easy talking about it in a meeting like this, but nothing beats actually going out and doing it.
Some people walk in pairs because one is social, and two, you learn from one another. It's important that only one person does the actual observation and the other one does the recording. But it's a nice way of working. It's working as a pair, and you learn much quicker from each other. Yeah.
Yeah. Nick, we're at just gone 9. I'm just wondering whether you want to. I know you've done all this moth.
I have. I've spent hours on this moth thing.
We're happy to send the presentation, the slides are out as well, aren't we? So people can benefit from them. We'll send out an invite to the moth session shortly.
And thank you very much, everybody. Until next time. Bye for now.